Jim's brother yelled over to him, telling him that it was too late to try to run. At this point in Mr. Capullo's recollection, his ability to recount information is, consistently, in a seemingly trance-like state, incapable of answering even the simplest of questions as to the time, location, or nature of the circumstances. He stated that there was another loud roar, louder than any of the other noises. At this, Mr. Capullo looked back to see that all the lights in his grandmother's home were off, and he realized that all of the street lights had gone out as well. There was another loud bark, and at this time the sky lit up again, but this time it was not like the brief dark purple flashes. The sky lit up as if it were in the middle of the day, which, according to Jim, it actually was. As the sky seemed to crack open, Mr. Capullo caught sight of what appeared to be dozens of missiles, each with a bright red flame projecting it toward its target, and each shooting up in a flash and then falling back down, as if in slow motion. They gave off a huge blast of light and fire, smoke and dust, all of which shot high enough into the sky to be seen from Jim's perspective. But even though there was no question that the missiles had hit their target, there was no noise when they impacted. The flashes in the sky continued, and the wide-winged planes began to trail lines of black smoke that seemed to dissipate the veins in the sky. He went back to his brother and asked him if he had anything they could get on the internet, hoping desperately to find out what had happened and if it was over. Jim grabbed his brother's phone and quickly found a news story about a problem at the military base a few miles away. The story was brief, only 4 to 5 lines long, updating in real time by some online reporter who claimed that there had been an accident and that a biological problem had been temporarily released. There was one picture of the scene, a very low-quality, depixelated image of what appeared to be a monster. It resembled, more than anything else, a sort of werewolf, with its chest sunken in and its body covered only in sporadic patches of hair. Based on its proximity to the walls around it, a few people and a tank a few dozen yards away, it was about 25 to 30 feet tall. Its fingers were too long for functionality. They seemed to droop down as if they were too heavy to be supported by the size of its hands. Mr. Capullo stated that when he turned to ask his brother about what it was that he was looking at, his brother was nowhere to be found. He stated that he went back into the home of his grandmother, all of the streets suddenly devoid of all the spectators watching and listening in their bathrobes and pajamas on their front lawns. Jim entered the pitch-black house and felt the walls with his hands, adjusting to the darkness just as he found the door to the basement. As he felt the walls down the steps, it dawned on him that entering someplace, any place, even his own grandmother's home, where he could not see exactly what was in front of him, was unthinkably dangerous. This dawned on him at exactly the same moment that his hand reached the cold, dark switches of the fuse box. He felt his way, 2 switches over, 7 switches down, and found a fuse that was facing the wrong direction. Jim flicked it over, and his basement illuminated into a world that he was all too familiar with. The basement looked as it should have, and as he walked up the stairs, he found the upstairs furnished exactly as it was the day before, all remnants of the surreal removed, and replaced with the eclectic novelties of an elderly woman. He found his grandmother lying asleep in her light blue nightgown, and his brother was nowhere to be found. By approximately 1:30 p.m., Jim stepped out onto the bright light of a sunny Cape Cod afternoon, just as a blue SUV pulled into his neighbor's house. A young couple stepped out, the man wearing a black pinstripe suit, his assumed fiancée or wife wearing a red peacoat. Mr. Capullo walked up to the front door of the house a minute or two after they walked in. The owner of the home, an older man who was a veteran of the Korean War, asked him what he was doing there, at which point It is at this point that Mr. Capullo's recollections of the events of February 10th, 2010 seem to end. They ended at this encounter with the veteran each time Mr. Capullo was interviewed and interrogated about this day. He consistently became incapable of recollecting how this transaction with the neighbor ended, and it was not until the next day that he approached the local police department. At first Mr. Capullo seemed calm and collected, asking questions pertaining to what he could recollect from the day before. He made particular effort to articulate that if anything he had witnessed was classified, he would remain silent, but the police remained completely baffled as to any of the circumstances of anything he described. As the days turned into weeks, his family became aware that his behavior was becoming erratic. It was his family that had begun the process of multiple psychiatrists, specialists, and doctors of abnormal cognitive activity to try to understand the core of his distress. The most perplexing factor of all interviews and all tests, after all psychological evaluations and measurements of moods and many therapies, all indicated that Mr. Jim Kapula was, or at least believed that he was, telling the irrefutable truth. There were no signs of any kinds of Alzheimer's, schizophrenia, or any other mental divergences by means of hypnosis, psychosis, epilepsy, or any other medically explainable mind-altering states. By the time the investigation got to the 11th, 12th, even the 13th interviewers, the purpose of the investigation was no longer trying to find the source of the cognitive lapse that had triggered such delusions, but simply to determine how such an unprecedented brain pattern of truth cognition could produce such an irrefutably impossible recollected scenario. Jim's brother, who shall remain anonymous due to the nature of this investigation, was irrefutably hundreds of miles away from Sandwich, Mass at the time of these events due to eyewitness testimonies and video surveillance evidence. Also, the neighbors who lived across the street from Mr. Kapula's grandmother stated repeatedly that they had little to no relationship with him during his time there, and that they, like all third parties questioned, had no recollection of any of the events he described from February 10th, 2010. The couple had no dog of any breed, and they also had no children. It is worth noting that they were particularly offended when persisted with questions pertaining to a very young daughter with blonde hair and only one arm, and that they felt that each line of questioning that they were subjected to, in pertinence to this investigation, was extremely invasive and inappropriate. Jim tried for months to make his claim that what he had actually perceived was real, to everyone and anyone who would listen, eventually obsessing over the events of that day incessantly. His campaign for an irrefutable revelation of the truth was unfortunately further fueled by the continuation of inquisitions, all of which only further proved that he was not mentally unsound, was not on drugs, was not dreaming, and was not under any other measurable mind-altering states. Mr. Kapula killed himself on July 3rd, 2010 by means of razor blades to both of his wrists. Little is known as to what the contents of his suicide letter contained. It has yet to be determined based on the evidence at hand, including hand biometric tests, polygraphs, and brain scans, that he was telling anything other than what he had actually witnessed on February 10th, 2010. Since the time of his death, numerous conspiracy theorists have pointed to the possibility that he actually witnessed a temporal experience traumatic enough to open his perspective into another dimension. What is certain is that